actually in week 3 of a 4-part series. We've been looking through the Gospel of John, looking through the life of Jesus, at some of the people that he encountered throughout his life, and the different people that he saw. And what we've seen as we've looked at a dead guy, because you don't get a whole lot more underdog than dead, and we looked at a woman that is just extraordinarily messy, has had the worst that life could offer her. What we found is that when it comes to Jesus and it comes to people, more often than not, when you find yourself on the side of the underdog, you find yourself on the side of Jesus. And that's been good news for us, right? Because what we've said is that for some reason, we all love a good underdog story. And I think what it is that someplace deep down inside of all of us, whether it's something from our past or something from our present or education or a lack of ability or our family stuff or for whatever reason it is, a lot of us feel like we play the role of underdog in our life. So when we get to see an underdog win, we feel like somehow inside of us, maybe, just maybe, there's hope for underdogs like us. And so as we've looked through the Gospel of John, we've seen that it's really good news for us because Jesus, just like us, tends to have a heart for people who are underdogs. If you've got a Bible this morning, and I hope you brought one, go ahead and turn to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. The underdog we looked at last week was the first half of this chapter, and the guy that we're going to look at this week is the last part of John chapter 4. And in fact, if you don't have a Bible with you, grab one of these. They're spread out all over the auditorium, and you can follow along with us. It's on page 742 of those Bibles. And if you don't own a Bible or one in a translation that you can understand, just keep this one. We'd love for you to have a copy, and you won't be alone. We've been giving away Bibles for about a year like this and have given away hundreds of Bibles to people that didn't have a copy. So you wouldn't be alone, and we'd love to give one to you. We'd love for you to have a copy of God's Word for you to keep with you. So 742 there as we continue this look at underdogs. Harold Cottam missed the first couple of urgent messages that were sent to him. He'd gone off duty and had spent some time talking to other people on the boat that he was on and had a good conversation, but had gone back to his room in order to check the sports scores and then lay down on his bed and go to sleep because it was after midnight. As he turned on the radio, for which he was responsible for operating, he received a call of somebody wanting him to relay a message to someone on a different ship. And so he, even though he was off duty, knew that he had time to do it and decided that he would oblige and relay this message to another ship that wasn't too far away from him, right there in the middle of the ocean. And so he called this other ship and immediately received a distress signal, a frantic call from this other boat who had been trying to contact him and was now in the process of sinking towards the bottom of the ocean. So Harold ran up to the captain's quarters and woke up the captain who had already gone to bed for the night. And the two of them began to push this boat that they were on to its limits. They pushed it into overdrive. And even though there was ice floating in the water around them, they turned off the heaters to all of the passengers' room in the boat that they were traveling on in order to milk every ounce of strength that the ship they were traveling on had so that they could get to the place where the other boat was in distress. The other boat's radio operators continued to relay coordinates to this boat, and yet, even still, everyone involved knew that by the time that rescue got there, it would be too late. Because even at its max speed, the ship that Cottam was on was only capable of traveling 20 miles an hour, and they were 60 miles away. And even as the sinking boat went under the water, the radio operators relayed coordinates to Cottam. And yet everybody knew that by the time his ship arrived for the RMS Titanic, it'd be too late. And sure enough, about 4 o'clock in the morning, the Carpathia arrived, the ship on which Cottam was a radio operator. And for 750 people in lifeboats, mostly women and children, 100 years ago last week, the rescue came in time. But for 1,500 others, hope was too far away to help. You ever feel like maybe your life is going to end up like that story? Like you call out to God And yet you sometimes wonder if perhaps he's gone off duty because there isn't a response. Right? You feel like your ship is about to sink. You feel like you're about to go underwater because there's a hole in your bow that's caused by an iceberg that you didn't see. And you feel like you're about to go underwater and you call out. And yet you feel like maybe he's already gone to bed for the night. He's gone off duty. He's too far away. And as desperate as you call out, as hard as you try, you wonder if maybe your life isn't headed for the same ending as the Titanic. And if for you, maybe, just possibly, hope is too far away to help. Well, I want to introduce you to an underdog this morning for whom that's his story. He's at the end of his rope. He's out of options. And he's a desperate, desperate underdog. And as he gets to the end of his rope and the clock's about to run out on him, he lobs up a Hail Mary. And it just so happens that Jesus is there to catch it. And what he is going to show us, just like these other underdogs in the Gospel of John, is that when you find yourself as an underdog, but you find yourself connected with Christ, underdogs instantly transform into favorites because of who Jesus is. So look with me at John chapter 4, page 742, as we look at this underdog. We're going to start in John chapter 4, verse 43, as Jesus is leaving Samaria, where he transformed a whole village by leaning into a really messy woman at a well. He spent 2 days there in Samaria, and now he's back on the road. That's where we pick up the story. Look at John chapter 4, beginning at verse 43. It says, after the 2 days, he left for Galilee. Now, Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So when he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They'd seen all he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they'd also been there. John starts off the story and he tells us Jesus gets ready to leave Samaria and he heads back towards Galilee, which, if you know anything about the story of Jesus, you know is where Jesus was from. And yet for all of the people that were following Jesus, Jesus gives them a little bit of a disclaimer. He gives them just a little bit of advice as to what they're going to walk into when they walk back into Galilee, because they hadn't been there in a small amount of time. And he says to his followers, he says to these people, prophets don't get the kind of welcome that you're expecting when they go back to their house. Right? And some of you experience this on a much smaller level, right? It's hard to get a right reception when you go home. Some of you run organizations, right? Or you volunteer at places where you're respected, you're well thought of. You get invited to sit at the head table at banquets that you go to. People ask for your advice, they ask for your opinion. Like, you give direction, and all of a sudden people start moving and people start doing things based on your direction or your advice or your input, right? When I became the lead pastor at McKinney Church, I've said the greatest thing about being lead pastor is when our staff goes on trips, I get automatic shotgun wherever it is that we go. It's the most amazing perk of my role. They just leave it open. And so and some of you have lived this, right? Wherever you are, maybe you volunteer in organizations or you lead an organization, and people listen to you. They follow you. They honor you. And then you go home. And you realize all of a sudden that it's different at home, right? I mean, we're at the office, at the agency, at the place that you're volunteering. When you give directions, people move. When you go home and you give directions, people sit. Right? I mean, when you go to the office and you give advice, people consider it. When you go home and you give advice, people disregard it. And at home, you realize you're no longer the CEO. You're the DAD, or the MOM, or the KID. And that's very, very, very different. Because at home, People have seen you walking around in your underwear. I mean, at home, people have seen you without makeup on. At home, there are people who for years changed your diaper. And it's awfully hard to take somebody seriously when you've changed their diaper. And so you don't get honor at home. Well, Jesus says on a lot bigger scale, it's the same thing for people who speak on behalf of God. When you go home, people see you as normal. They see you as familiar. They see you as the kid for whom they changed his diaper. And it's hard to get a welcome, or at least it's hard to be honored when you find yourself at home. That's what happened in Galilee. People welcomed Jesus, it says in verse 45, but he warned his disciples, don't be confused. The welcome that we're receiving is not honor, because a prophet doesn't get honor when he goes home. And in verse 45 says why it wasn't honor. These people had been with Jesus. They'd been near in John chapter 2 at Passover in Jerusalem when Jesus did all kinds of cool tricks. And they'd watched him do these amazing things. And the word had gotten out that Jesus was extraordinarily powerful. And these people saw Jesus not as a prophet, but as a celebrity. And now that he was home, they wanted a private encore performance. See, they didn't see him as one who spoke on behalf of God, and so they didn't honor him. Instead, they welcomed him as a celebrity. And see, here's the deal with a celebrity. If you've ever met anybody or know anybody that's in the performing arts, you realize that your worth in the performing arts is only ever as good as your last performance. And these people see Jesus and had been around in John chapter 2. And they see him as a celebrity. See, people don't love celebrities for who they are. People don't honor celebrities for who they are. They don't know who they are. They honor celebrities because of what they've done last. And that's a huge difference. But that's the scene when we meet this underdog at the end of John chapter 4 who isn't from Jesus' home. And Jesus and John are going to draw this contrast between someone who simply welcomes Jesus as a celebrity and somebody who honors him for who he is. Look at John chapter 4, verse 46 and 47. Once more, he visited Cana in Galilee, where he turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Now, we don't know a whole lot about this guy. We don't know his name. We don't know his background. He was probably Jewish because of the way that Jesus is going to lump him into this situation, but we don't know much about his heritage. We don't even know specifically what his position was. He could have been someone with a whole lot of influence and a whole lot of power, like a Roman centurion, or he could have been one of the regular servants in the quarters of the king. The only thing that we know about him is that he served as a part of the Roman government. And yet he approaches Jesus. And there's a pretty strong possibility that if he was Jewish and he worked for the Roman king, when he approached Jesus, he would have been instantly and suddenly surrounded by a whole lot of people that hated his guts. Because Jewish people saw people who worked for Rome as traitors, especially if they were Jewish. They saw them as agents of an occupying government who had taken over their land. And we see this man about 20 miles from home where he'd traveled on foot and left the foot of the bedside of his dying son to find Jesus. Now, not a whole lot of us can imagine or put ourselves in this guy's shoes. But think about what this guy has just done. He finds out Jesus is in Galilee, and he travels probably by foot 20 miles to see Jesus and beg him to heal his son. This guy leaves the bedside of his dying small child to go to a person that there's a decent chance is going to hate him and provide nothing at all. What in the world would possess a father to leave the bedside of his dying child? A glimmer of hope, perhaps, and no other options. And when you look at this guy's story, you realize he has to have exhausted every possible resource at his disposal. Every possible doctor, every possible treatment, every possible dollar he could spend. And this is his last resort. This is this guy's desperation SOS call in the middle of the night, hoping against hope that maybe somebody will hear. His position and his power couldn't fix it. His resources couldn't fix it. He's the underdog and time is running out. Jesus is his last hope. And he believes that Jesus could. He believes that Jesus should. And he's hoping that Jesus isn't too far away. Jesus decides to use this moment as this man does what the NIV translates as beg. Jesus decides to use it as a teaching moment to show the hearts of the people that were following him the difference between welcoming a celebrity and honoring someone who comes on behalf of God. So look at verse 48. Jesus looks at the crowd and he says, "Unless you people see signs and wonders," Jesus told him, "you will never believe." Jesus says, unless you people see signs, and the literal translation of the word wonders mean things that make you go, wow. And unless you see stuff that makes you go, wow, you're never going to believe in me. You're going to miss who I am because you haven't yet seen all that I'm capable of. He looks at this crowd and he calls out their heart. See, these aren't people who honored him. These aren't people who loved him for who he is. They surrounded him because of what he did last. Their faith was only as strong as the things that Jesus had done for them on the front end, and so they've demoted Jesus to the status of just an employee whose only worth to you is his previous job performance. And Jesus points out the distinction to them. See, if you believe in who he is, not just what you've seen him do, but if you believe in who he is, it totally transforms the way that you wait when you make your SOS call. Because now the question is no longer whether or not he's capable. The question is whether or not he's good. You know he's capable because he's God. Your only question is whether or not he's good. And if he's good and he's capable, you can honor him even while you wait. And Jesus says to these people, you're missing the point of who I am. Because the only way that you'll believe in me is when you see what I've done in the past. The official, as you might imagine, if you can put yourself in his shoes, he's not really up for the sermon. He's got a sick kid at home, and he's really ready for Jesus to make a move. And he's also not in the group of people that Jesus is condemning, and he proves it. Look at verses 49 to the first part of 50. The royal official says to Jesus, and you can just imagine the exasperation in his voice, "Sir, come down before my child dies." "Go," Jesus replied. "Your son will live." And Jesus shows us a couple of things. First, through the mistake that this official's made. See, you've seen him twice come to Jesus and ask Jesus to come to Capernaum in order that he can heal the kid. See, no doubt he's heard of what Jesus did in John chapter 2 too. And he knows that Jesus is capable of some amazing things, but the only things he's ever seen Jesus do are the things that Jesus was present to do. And so somehow, in some way, he believes that Jesus' power is limited by Jesus' location. He tries to get Jesus to go to Capernaum twice because he believes that where he is currently, Jesus is just too far away. And yet Jesus looks at the man and without budging from Cana says, go. The kid's going to be fine. And in doing so, he gives us a glimpse into exactly who he is. He's not just a celebrity. He's not just a magician. He's not just an illusionist. He's the creator God for whom distance and disease are no match. He's the God who can overcome the problem of disease and distance. And even though he's far away, he's close enough. And Jesus gives us lesson 1 for underdogs who feel like our SOS call has gone unanswered. When we feel like hope may be too far away to help, Jesus shows us, even in his word, the God who seems far away is never too far away. The God who seems far away is never too far away. He speaks the word, your son's going to be fine, and he tells the man to go home. And he shows who he is, the creator God who's not limited by space. He's not limited by time. He's not worried about being late. And he tells the man it's okay to go home. And the official has a decision to make, doesn't he? He's got a question to ask himself. And the question, as John puts it, is, do I believe that Jesus is who he says he is? Or is he just another celebrity? And the way that he answers the question will be manifest in the way he begins to walk. See, the question for him is, do I believe that Jesus' promises are as good as his provision? And the way that we know how this man believes, the way that we know whether or not he's just welcoming a celebrity or honoring someone sent from God, is all revealed in the way that he walks. And as you watch this scene unfold, you can imagine the pause as the official wonders, do I believe that Jesus' promises are as good as his provision? Because Jesus asks this man to begin the walk home based on a promise, even before he sees what Jesus will do. And isn't this the same question that we get to answer on a regular basis? Do we believe that his promises are as good as his provision? Because see, here's the deal about walking with Jesus. Jesus often asks us to walk in light of his promises before he allows us to walk away from his provision. Jesus also often asks us to walk in light of his promises before we get to walk in light of his provision. Sometimes Jesus asks us to walk as if we believe that he will supply all of our needs according to his riches, before he provides all of our needs according to his riches, right? I mean, sometimes God calls us to walk home to a marriage that is struggling, believing that he has promised to be the God of reconciliation before we see him work in our marriage as the God of reconciliation, don't we? Sometimes we have to walk as a person who is the recipient of injustice based on the promise that God will right all wrongs before we see our enemy meet his end. And isn't this the question that we get to answer on a regular basis as we walk with Jesus? Do we believe that his promises are as good as his provision? See, it's an act of worship. It's an act of honor. And it shows that we trust in Jesus because of who he is. See, we know his word is good. That we know that he cares for us. It's an act of worship to choose to start walking even before we see specifically what he'll do. That honors him. When we see him for who he is, not just what he did last. And so I want to ask you a question this morning. How are you walking? Where are you walking? See, there are some of you here this morning who spent your whole life welcoming Jesus. You welcomed him as a celebrity. Maybe you've lived vicariously through the lives of other people who followed him, who honored him, who worshiped him. Maybe you've shown up at church your whole life. But as you look at the question that this man gets to answer, you realize you've treated Jesus as a celebrity. And the operating question that you've asked on a regular basis has been, what has Jesus done for me recently? Not who is this Jesus that I'm following? And yet you've never believed in who Jesus is. The Bible says that Jesus came to earth as God to heal your greatest sickness, a sick heart that said, I would rather be God. I would make a better God than God. And a heart that the Bible says is deceitfully sick and wicked, that has decided to go its own way, and a heart that deserves in the economy of God to die. The Bible says Jesus came to the earth as God to die for your heart so that you didn't have to. And that he offers you the gift, a gift of everlasting life that can be received simply by faith. And it may be that this morning you find yourself here as a person who spent your whole life in church, your whole life knowing Christ followers, and yet you realize that there has never been a place, never been a time when you transferred your trust in yourself and your ability to respond in an SOS to Christ, to the only person who can. This morning, I want to give you the opportunity to do that. If you've spent your whole life welcoming Jesus and never honored him, and you've never connected with Christ, I would just invite you in this moment, in this time, to make that connection for the very first time. The Bible says you don't have to do something religious. You don't have to say a specific magic formula. You don't have to go through a ritual. You don't have to go through a ceremony. It's not about what you promise to do or promise not to do or what you bring. It's simply about believing in what Jesus has done. Believing in who he is and trusting him for the promise of everlasting life. And in this moment, in this time, you may respond to God simply by thanking God for what he's done in words that you can change, but sound something like this: God, I'm thankful that you sent Jesus as my provision, and this morning I'm trusting him for the promise of eternity, even before I see your provision of eternity. This morning, because Jesus died for me and he rose from the dead and he took the penalty for my sick heart, I'm trusting him for forgiveness. And I'm connecting with Christ today. And if that's you, if this morning you're connecting with Christ for the very first time, we would love to celebrate with you. It's not about being religious. It's not about doing a ceremony, but we would love to know so that we can celebrate with you. And there's a place on that connection card that Rob mentioned earlier where you can let us know that today you're connecting with Christ for the very first time. And we'd love the privilege to be able to celebrate with you, to be able to worship with you, and to also give you some resources that can help you start walking in light of who Jesus is. So if you would take that out these doors after the service is over and drop them at one of those connection centers or at the welcome center that you saw in the middle there as you came in, we'd love to give you a bag full of resources that can help you start walking. And we'd love to be able to celebrate with you what Jesus has done in your life. There's another group of us that are here this morning, maybe for whom you connected with Christ a long time ago. And yet you realize that in your life you've drifted and no longer do you walk in light of who he is. No longer do you worship in light of who he is, but you find yourself just responding to him as a celebrity. And if this morning you'd like to reconnect, to return to this connection with Christ that you had before, that you didn't lose it, he didn't leave, but you walked away, and this morning you'd say, I'd like to return to that. There's a place on that connection card where you can mark that too. We'd love to celebrate with you as well. And to rejoice with you in what it is that Jesus has done on your behalf. We'd love for you to be able to have the chance to go public and tell your story. There's a place on the connection card where you can tell us if you want to go public with your faith through baptism. Because here's the deal, and this man shows us. This kind of worship, when you believe in who Jesus is, when you believe in what Jesus says, when you decide to worship him and honor him in light of who he is and walk in light of his promises even before his provision, That kind of worship is contagious. Look at the story and how it ends. Verse 50, the second half of the verse, says, the man, here's his response, took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that the boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, yesterday, at 1 p.m, the fever left him. Then the father realized this was the exact time at which Jesus said to him, your son will live. So he and his whole household believed. The man took Jesus at his word and he started walking in light of Jesus' promise. And he meets some guys on the road and he asks them a question. And the word that he asks them, he says, hey, when did he start to gradually get better? And they said, no, you don't understand. At 1 o'clock yesterday afternoon, the fever went away. And he realized, this man saw and he realized that Jesus was in the process of providing long before this Roman official knew it. See, here's the deal. Sometimes this kind of provision shows up really quickly. Sometimes it takes a long time. I know people who have waited decades to see God's provision in their life. And yet, step after step, they've walked, trusting God that his promises were enough and that he would provide even when he hasn't yet. And even when the SOS is going out and the distress and the ship is sinking in their life, they've continued to worship and continued to walk for decades. And I got to tell you, I don't ever want to have their circumstances, but I want to worship like them. Because there's something about walking, trusting, believing, even before you see, that's contagious. It was for this guy. The last verse says his whole household believed. And if he was a centurion, if he had a lot of influence, this could have been dozens of people that heard his story. And as a result of his story, were able to connect with Christ. Mom and Dad, you want your kids to believe that there is a God in heaven who is powerful, who is able, who is capable, who loves them? You're going to have to walk step after step in front of your kids at times when you desperately need a God who is powerful and capable and good and loves you even before he provides. So how are you walking this morning?